right, welcome to Two Teachers and a Table. We are your hosts. This is Mr. Bergman and I am Mr. Ripka. Today our topic of discussion is going to be Mark Twain, specifically the adventures of Huckleberry Finn. We are lucky enough today to have with us Mr. Bergman for this conversation because he was at one point the educational tour docent of Mark Twain's house in Hartford, Connecticut. So we have a sort of resident expert here on Mark Twain. So this is fantastic. I should like to begin by talking about the adventures of Huckleberry Finn, and specifically one portion that I'm going to read aloud and ask Mr. Bergman to help explain. So it's at the very beginning of the book. It is a notice from the author to the reader. And it says here, many of us have read this, and maybe many of us have been perplexed by it, as I am. It says, and I quote, "Persons attempting to find a motive in this narrative will be prosecuted. Persons attempting to find a moral in it will be banished. And persons attempting to find a plot in it will be shot." Mr. Bergman, I should like to begin by asking you, how am I supposed to reconcile this statement with the 200 plus pages of words that he has written? Am I really not supposed to find a plot in this book?
No, you're supposed to be able to find the plot. What you just read is typical Mark Twain humor. Mark Twain was very self-deprecating, and that was part of his charm in being a humorist. It's an interesting, you should mention that in particular, because I've heard of different celebrities who have been on television shows that were aimed toward comedy, and directors would sometimes complain because those who were performing comedy were doing it with self-deprecation, and it was considered like degrading.
Is it less funny or something?
No, it's funny when you make fun of yourself. True. And Mark Twain always did that. Mark Twain, too, never minded being the butt of his own jokes, because that was his sense of humor. He realized that he was funny, and in order to make himself funnier, when he would present himself in an image that people would laugh at, he was pretty much out to get a laugh. We found out when he lived in Hartford, Connecticut, with his wife Olivia, in particular, Olivia Langdon. She used to call him Youth.
Why?
Because he acted like a child all the time, and he would, do funny things just at the spur of the moment when they had guests. Some of which could be sometimes inappropriate.
Would you say like they're sometimes like petulant and insubordinate and stuff, or not like that sort
goofy.
Of childish, just goofy,
yeah, goofy,
childish,
and to the point where people wondered if he had too much to drink,
which he probably did.
Robert, well,
what did he drink?
Well, actually, he drank, but he never was known to drink to excess. But there is a strong belief that he may have been a little bipolar, or a little bit of ADHD, and as a result, he just he had a hard time sitting still.
Would he have then like moments of great ecstasy? Is that what you mean by bipolar? Great bliss, and then moments of great sadness.
When he wanted to write and really got passionate about his work, he would more or less be confined for long periods of time to his billiard room in the house where he did his writing. And he was very dedicated to it. And there were other times where he would just let it go and not do other things. One of my favorite jokes about him is he would say that when guests came up, my wife thinks that I'm up here working, because his billiard table was in there. So he may have just been,
playing billiards,
right, playing billiards,
shooting pool,
shooting the balls around.
Oh, yeah.
And so...
yeah,
but that was Mark Twain.
And to come back to this quote for a second, it says, persons attempting to find a motive in the narrative will be prosecuted, and then to find a moral will be banished, and a plot will be shot. I wonder if we can't, for a second, discuss the difference between motive, moral, and plot.
Well, I think in order to understand this in regard to the book, and incidentally, even though I teach English, I'm more acquainted with Twain as a a person or a figure, American figure.
As opposed to
than-
the
as opposed
literary
to
analysis
literary,
of the work or something.
Matter of fact, but Huckleberry Finn is one of his novels that I have read, excessively, because I taught it for so many years.
And I want to interject for a second because I remember our first episode. I asked you, "Does America have a national epic?" And you convincingly, to me, argued that the national epic was The Great Gatsby.
Right.
And I was not surprised at that, but I think other people could have argued that Huckleberry Finn is America's national epic, or perhaps Moby Dick or something like this. We didn't even bring up Huckleberry Finn, I think, in that conversation about being a great American epic.
And it fits some of the traditional epic components.
It seems to. You have this adventure down the water,
Uh-huh.
right? And you have a lot of various sort of qualities of an epic there.
But then you have a hero. That's the thing.
No, yeah.
Okay, is there really a hero in Huck Finn?
Yeah, and I want to say, yeah, well, I would guess I would say Huck Finn would be the hero, but who knows if we got into that. I feel like
Not
through a
particularly,
conversation I would probably be convinced otherwise.
He's heroic in the sense that he faced hardships and got through them, but he didn't produce much. Besides his own learning experience, he didn't produce much. And we'll talk about that when.
Yeah, I think. Yeah, Huck Finn. There's that great moment that where he's crossing the water and he's thinking about taking Jim into the authorities, and halfway through he decides he's not going to do it. And he turns around. That does seem like an important moment for Huck's life of maturation.
And he may be considered a hero to Jim, but we can talk about that after the words that you were talking about.
I'm curious what's the differences between a motive and a moral, because he seems to be distinguishing that if you try to find a motive in my book, you're going to be prosecuted. But then it's almost like if you find a moral, you're going to be banished. So it's almost he seems to be distinguishing these two words.
Well, something about that notice I'm not certain of as to when it was added to the book.
That's a good point. Yeah.
Mark Twain took a hiatus while writing Huckleberry Finn. When Huckleberry Finn started, he originally conceived of it as being a sequel to Tom Sawyer. Tom Sawyer is, distinctly a children's book, or appeals to young adults. And Huck Finn was going to be the same way, but suddenly it picks up a more mature, and in many cases a darker flavor as well.
And Huckleberry, The Adventures of Tom Sawyer, that was written in a pretty, I guess, without dialect. I feel like it was written. Huck Finn has tons of dialect.
Tom Sawyer has dialect.
So Tom Sawyer has dialect, but the narrator is not Tom Sawyer.
Right.
And the narrator is not Huck Finn.
Right.
There's a different narrator. But here this book starts, Huckleberry Finn, that is, with, "You don't know about me without you have read a book by the name of Adventures of Tom Sawyer. But that ain't no matter. That was a book made by Mr. Mark Twain, and he told the truth mainly." Right? And so you have a character in here who is the narrator here. So Huck Finn, this whole book is through the eyes of Huck Finn.
And that's the reason why the dialect is in there, because he's actually... He's doing all the speaking.
Yeah, so everything happens through the perspective of Huck Finn.
Huck Finn.
If he's not there, you don't get the picture. But in Tom Sawyer, you have a sort of omniscient narrator.
Right, exactly. And the problem, anyway, with Huck Finn, as far as like finding the moral, I think has to do with... As a matter of fact, that 7-year hiatus and him coming back to writing it is considered a flaw. It's called The Flaw of Huckleberry Finn. And a lot of people really don't understand what it is until they've actually read it. And I can tell you about any teacher of English who has taught it will tell you about teaching it and how to be aware of that change that's going to take place in him waiting 7 years to finish it.
Do you know how much he had written before he stopped?
You can pretty much tell where, almost to the end, apparently, in the direction that the book was going. What you have to remember, and what really distinguishes this book from Tom Sawyer, is that Huckleberry Finn is realism compared to Tom Sawyer.
Which is romanticism?
Definitely, yeah. Tom Sawyer is simply all childhood fantasy. And you as an adult reading it, or as an older child reading it, first off, if you're a child reading it, you identify with that fantasy. if you're older and reading it, you remember when you were a child and thought that way. And Life in the Mississippi is the same way. He's constantly talking from a perspective of a child, memories of childhood from an adult. And now realizing that what you thought was important, big, or things that you didn't even realize what they really were. And Huck Finn has that quality. Huck Finn's describing something, and because it's first-person narration, it's up to you to figure what he's talking about, what he does understand, what he doesn't understand. Sometimes what he doesn't understand is what's humorous about it, because you know.
Yep.
And that's the irony. The irony of the book is the fact that the reader knows things that the main character doesn't.
Yeah. That's
Dramatic irony.
It is dramatic irony. Yeah, that's quite curious. I'm kind of curious. Like, if Mark Twain were around and I went up to him and I was like, Mark, I really liked your book, Huckleberry Finn, and what I really liked about it is that it kind of, I found a moral in it, that slavery's wrong. He would be like, are you saying he would tell me, you're banished, get out of here? I mean, like it says, if you find a moral, you will be banished.
Because if you read the rest of the book, it makes you wonder if that is the true moral.
And I guess, is there...
Well, this is the flaw. This is the flaw of the book. You have Tom Sawyer, in a much more sense of realism, survived. First of all, he's an abused child. His father, is physically abuses him. And he stays with his father, though, because he does love him, and his father is all he has in the way of family. So right away you realize this is a serious subject matter. Tom Sawyer is with Aunt Polly. Aunt Polly, she's strict and she can be, a little bit cantankerous, but she's a good woman. Mm-hmm. And
she has her head in the right place.
Right, exactly. Yeah. And a big heart, too. Mm-hmm. And Huck Finn, his father's abusive, and he's an alcoholic, and he's even worse when he's inebriated. And Huck Finn is eventually put into foster care of the widow Douglas. And the widow Douglas is very similar to Aunt Polly in trying to raise him to be
civilized, if I remember right.
Yeah, exactly. Respectable.
I love the way he spells it, too. He misspells it throughout the book.
Yeah, it starts with an S.
Yeah, it starts with an S, which makes sense. I guess.
So his situation's very serious. He also runs into the reality of slavery, running into the fact that Miss Watson, who's the widow Douglas' sister, has a slave, a laborer slave that labors in a domestic sense, doesn't work on a plantation. But he does all the, heavy grunt work around the property. And so, Huck is faced with these realities. Then Huck is eventually faced with the reality of how do you get away from abused father when a court system has allowed the father to get custody despite the known abuse.
I see.
And
there's serious themes in this book.
Right, exactly.
Although I don't want to find the theme, I feel like he might.
Right.
Mark Twain might be like, don't look for the theme or the moral. But.
And things that topics today that you wouldn't add the sense of humor to, that Mark Twain adds into. Sometimes, Pap is his father is very mean spirited, and and Huck can be very afraid of him. But some of what you see Pap doing, you may laugh at. Because of the way Huck is interpreting it. So anyway, Huck ends up in this situation where he has to get away from this, and then he has to deal with the fact that he's traveling with an escaped slave. And so, he's learning. He learns to accept Jim, the escaped slave, as an equal. But it takes him a lot to be able to do that. But the relationship is complex between the two because you're dealing with a free white boy who, however, has run away that people believe are dead.
That's true. Yeah.
Right, they're looking for a body some way or another. A slave has run away who knew this boy, and so the slave gets accused of possibly murdering him because of the way Huck set it up to make it look like somebody had been murdered.
And wasn't it the whole time, though, that Jim was freed or something like this?
Well,
like at the end?
That comes with the flaw.
That comes with the flaw.
Right. And so what happens is you have Huck the relationship between Huck and Jim develops to the point where they realize how they're symbiotic. And is their relationship based on the convenience? Huck needs an adult, and Jim is that adult.
That's a good point.
And Jim needs a white person who can go out and get things. And can move along freely in civilization. Because they go to other towns where Huck's not recognized, where Jim simply could not show up.
Right.
An African-American man, unaccompanied, it would be suspicious.
Totally. And he'd probably be arrested.
And they're looking for him as either escaped slave or murderer. So, so he depends upon Huck to get him food and supplies and other things that he needs. And eventually, though, they've realized that there were things they didn't have to do for one another that they did. Huck plays tricks on Jim, and some of them is disappearing, and Jim fears. Now, first of all, you say, oh, Jim only cares because he lost that connection to the world. But then you find out he was seriously worried about Huck. He was afraid Huck was hurt or killed because he cared about him. And Huck realizes that. And then the two realize they have developed a friendship. Right, which is really important. Now, where the flaw takes place is Huck ends up at the very end of the novel on a plantation after escaping a lot of bad circumstances. And he ends up at that plantation because he finds out that Jim has been captured and taken to that plantation. And eventually, of all people, Tom Sawyer shows up at that plantation.
Of course.
And because he's related. As a matter of fact, the woman, the mistress of the plantation, is related to
Our Tom Sawyer.
Not to Tom Sawyer, but to
Is it his
Aunt Polly. Is related to Aunt Polly, and he goes there to visit.
Okay.
Apparently. And then one thing leads to another. It's, more complicated than that. But yes, Jim is actually free. And Huck knows, Huck doesn't know it, but Tom knows it. And Tom arranges all these ways that they're going to try to get Jim out. And
even though he knows he's free,
right?
Because he's like
but Jim doesn't
Don
know
Quixote, and he wants an adventure.
Yes,
essentially.
Exactly. Right.
That is Tom Sawyer.
Right.
Yeah.
Jim doesn't know, and Huck doesn't know, and they're going through these ridiculous motions, and really putting poor Jim through the ringer.
Poor guy.
And doing this, and finally, you find out, and that Jim had been free all the time, and that he had just become a victim of Tom Sawyer's foolishness, and that Huck had been a deliberate part of that foolishness. There were other things that Huck was doing. They were stealing things from the woman who owned the plantation to act as the trappings for whatever it was that they needed.
I think I remember that
to get Jim to escape. And so and Huck, excuse me, Huck had been through incredible adventures where he should have grown up a lot because he had to go. He saw people murdered. He saw, a dead body who ended up being his father.
Yeah, I remember. He saw those Shakespeare people too. Remember the Shakespearean players?
Right. He dealt with really dangerous people. Jim almost getting caught. Real harsh realities of life. Wondering where their next meal was coming from, and suddenly he's back down to Tom Sawyer's level. Tom Sawyer, who's just a prankster and playful and doesn't understand, everything is pretend. And Huck Finn, rather than imparting his wisdom to Tom or saying, I'm not going to be a part of that tomfoolery,
Nice.
No pun intended, goes along with him. It's still looking at Tom Sawyer as a leader.
It almost suggests like the bad apple ends up harming the good apple more than the good apple helps the bad apple or something, right? Which I guess in a bag of apples that does happen. The bad apple will affect the good apples more than the good apple will affect the bad apples. Yeah.
Right. So so technically, Jim has been abused again by being a victim of this game that took weeks to play. and finally finding out and being set free so that he could, and finally he could be with his family. But only after what a price to pay after he's already paid for years and years of slavery and being divided from his family. That should have been it. And then at the end, Huck and Tom are just looking off into the sunset, planning their next adventure. And so, what did Huck learn? Where is the moral when, you feel that Huck didn't learn anything and you have to go chapter after chapter after chapter at the end, with this foolishness, that really has no bearing on the plot whatsoever. So that's my reasoning as to why it would not be considered an epic book, why you wouldn't be able to find a moral.
I see.
And a moral. What was the other thing?
It was a motive, a moral, and a plot. I do want to talk about plot.
Right, that's a plot up to a point.
Yeah. All right, so I would also like to focus in on this last clause here where it says a person's attempting to find a plot in it will be shot. It is hard to talk about any book without talking about a plot. So, anytime you talk about any movie or book or anything, it's like, did you like it? Yeah. What was it about? And then you tell what it's about. Is he trying to dissuade us from having conversations about the plot of this book?
I just wondered, and I'm glad you mentioned that too, because if he wrote this when he was finished and he himself realized the flaw, that. He may have gotten that criticism. Mark Twain used to give, excerpts of his work to other writers to read. And somebody may have criticized. I don't know. As far as I know, maybe somebody.
I like the idea. That is, he finished it, and then people were like, what is the plot of this thing? And what are you trying to say? And he was like, you know what? I'm just going to write a notice at the beginning. Don't even look for one.
Right, exactly. And I think that's why the book may end the way it ends.
And it ends in a cyclical way, kind of?
Yeah.
Is that right? That is it. The book ends, and the reader almost thinks like, hey, we're going to have another book, right? Because he says something.
Yeah, it seems to be almost set up for a sequel.
Yeah, exactly. He says here, if I'd knowed what a trouble it was to make a book, I wouldn't have tackled it and ain't gonna to no more. But I reckon I got to light out for the territory ahead of the rest because Aunt Sally, she's going to adopt me and civilize me, and I can't stand it. I've been there before.
And that's how the novel starts out.
And it wasn't Aunt Sally, it was Aunt Polly.
In his case, Widow Douglas.
Or Widow Douglas, thank you. And he had escaped from Widow Douglas and escaped from being civilized by her and all that.
Right.
But then by the end, he has a new sort of guardian who wants to civilize
It's the same exact thing.
So it's almost like, just come back to the beginning and go through again. He could have had a serial, essentially, of Huck Finn adventures.
And that's interesting, too. The whole idea is the fact that Mark Twain can blame Huck Finn for not writing. Huck Finn is taking credit for writing the book at the end.
Yeah, and at the beginning, because that part I read, he's like, you don't know me, right? You only know me from Tom Sawyer, but that was made by Mark Twain. And he basically said the truth, but that's nothing. I've never seen anybody but lied one time or another. And he goes, but at any rate, this is my book.
Right. And then at the end, though, he repeats it again, saying that about writing a book, if I'd known it was that much trouble. So, Huck is not a writer. He's not particularly smart. He doesn't observe things the way they really happen. We assume if Mark Twain stretches the truth, so does Huck Finn.
Yeah. He's not what we would call a reliable narrator.
Right. No, certainly not. And he steals, he cheats, regularly. And justifies it all through there. So when you have this really unreliable person who's not a writer, Mark Twain can simply blame him and say that's why there's no plot.
Yeah. I want to bring up what one of our colleagues have said about this notice here. I really like what you're saying, and I tend to agree with kind of what you're saying. But Mr. Link, like I said, one of our colleagues, claims. This is a suggestion by him, is a sort of guess, that he means the exact opposite of this on the notice. He's suggesting that he's using reverse psychology. So it's kind of like when you can say, you can go in this door, you can go in this door, you can go in this door, but you can't go in that door. well, where does everybody want to go?
Right.
To that door right there that you're not allowed to do. So you have the author telling people, don't find a narrative, don't find a moral, don't find a plot. And his idea was, that's going to make people want to go find a narrative, a moral, and a plot.
He's challenging the reader.
Yeah, it's a curious thought, and I think it doesn't necessarily conflict with yours entirely. He can be both ironic about it and kind of serious about it. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's Mark Twain. I mean, Mark Twain's a master of language. If you read his essays, just to figure out,
they're brilliant, right?
Yeah, Corn Pone Opinions is probably one of the best examples of that kind of writing.
And it's so funny.
It is.
It's so good, yeah. So many of, I mean, he actually has quite a few works. I think we all know Tom Sawyer and Huck Finn, but I mean, he has
Pudd'nhead Wilson.
Pudd'nhead Wilson, the Yankee and Connecticut
Do you know
Court.
what inspired Pudd'nhead Wilson?
No.
It's fun because you're dealing with a set of Italian twins. And there was actually, touring the United States at the time, was a set of conjoined Italian twins.
Wow.
The Tacci brothers. And, they were conjoined at the hip, I believe. And whatever it is affected their walking. And they basically climb like spiders. They were part of a freak show at Mark Twain's time, which is a big deal to come and see that. And Mark Twain had seen the show. And originally, and I think the subtitle is like Those Amazing Twins to Pudd'nhead Wilson. And he has, it's two Italian lawyers, who are twins, but they're not conjoined. But originally, he was going to conjoin them, have them be conjoined twins.
That's great.
So I think that's interesting. You know how he's inspired by a satire of the popular foibles of his time.
Yeah.
So, which he does with Corn Pone.
I'm glad you brought up. I'm glad you brought up his life some, because since you did work as a docent at the educational tour company there of Mark Twain's house, I'm sure you have a lot of information about this fellow's life. And unlike somebody like Shakespeare or Homer, there is a lot of information about Mark Twain. There's been biographies that are recently printed even about Mark Twain.
Well, Mark Twain had written he wrote his own biography.
Did he write it, and then did he? Am I wrong about saying he then didn't want it published until a certain time?
Yes, that's absolutely right. As a matter of fact, that's why it came out when it came. It was exactly 100 years after whatever time.
How brilliant! So many people probably, I would imagine, would want their books published right now, so I can get the fame and all that. But I guess he already had the fame.
Well, he wanted to make sure people were dead, because he speaks very clearly about his opinions. And he always did.
So
Mark Twain never, ever held back his opinion on people.
And if no one's going to read it who's alive, you really don't have to hold back your opinion. It actually frees you, I guess, to write what you want. That's pretty interesting.
The odd thing is, even though Mark Twain could be that way, opinionated about people, and sometimes he was very general, or he wasn't. You sort of knew who he was talking about, but he didn't come out and say it. He was never quite, he was never completely unliked. It's people like Edgar Allan Poe who criticized everybody he ever met, and they hated it, absolutely hated him. So when he died, they wrote all these bad things that you believe about Edgar Allan Poe were written by people that he, got angry during his lifetime. And of course, he died fairly young, and they just went at it after he died. Because he wasn't alive to defend himself.
Hard to find the truth when there's so much vitriol.
Exactly.
There's so much passion against somebody.
And Mark Twain, Mark Twain too. He lived a long life. He did see a lot of he saw his whole family except for his one daughter die. His whole immediate family. Only one of his family members survived him.
As did
the
Edgar
middle
Allan
daughter,
Poe.
not even the younger. Yeah.
What'd you say?
His middle daughter lived to be into the 1960s.
Oh wow!
But his one daughter died at 26, the other at 29.
Interesting.
And of course, but when the second daughter, the youngest daughter died, his wife had already died.
If we could come back to his life for a second, I'm curious about. So his real name's not Mark Twain.
Right.
Most of us are aware of this. It's Samuel Clemens.
Right. Samuel Langhorne Clemens.
What's the middle name?
Langhorne.
Langhorne. Okay, so that's his real name.
Right.
Why choose Mark Twain? Is there something special about the name Twain?
The story always goes that when he worked on the boat, a Twain was 2 fathoms.
Oh, length.
Right.
It's a length thing.
And in order, the Mississippi, the channels are very unreliable because the river shifts all the time. So they have to stop at certain areas in order to test the channel. They drop the mark in, and they mark Twain, which means to mark 2 fathoms.
So his name is Mark Two Fathoms.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Or 2 Twains. Yeah, 2
Two
fathoms.
Two
Yeah,
fathoms.
exactly.
Yeah, Mark Two Fathoms.
Right,
I guess Mark
exactly.
Twain sounds a
Yeah,
little
so
better.
right. So when they said, well, they called that the Mark Twain, and so he
Oh,
just took it as a name.
how curious.
And his, of course, he always says it's association with the rivers.
Yeah,
That
it's
he
a
was
character
on
in
and
this
whatever.
book.
Right, and he worked as a pilot on a steamboat for a period of time. He's got a job for his brother Henry on the boat after he left the service, and the boat that Henry was on exploded, and Henry was killed. And he always blamed himself for that. And he blamed himself for anybody in his family that died. He blamed himself for it, and of course that's much more story than I can tell here. But what is it? They took a lot of that sadness into his life with him. And eventually, as he becomes an old man, he's known to be very bitter.
He becomes a curmudgeon
Yeah,
when he gets older?
he's basically living by himself in New York City at the time in an apartment, and nice apartment. I mean, he lost a tremendous amount of money in his lifetime by investing in. There were 2 types of printing machines, and he invested in the bad way, like people invested in Beta rather than VCR, and so he lost a lot of money. It was a page typesetter that he invested in, the linotype, which was used well into the digital age, was the machine that made it. And so he lost all that money. So that made him bitter. He lost that beautiful house in Hartford. They didn't live there he only had it for about maybe 10 or 11 years.
Was it a museum now?
Yeah.
And so when he lost it...
It's a historic home.
It's historical.
I'd like to distinguish that because there are no ropes or displays. It is furnished exactly like it would have been when he lived there.
So nobody bought it after he did?
No, actually it had belonged to a number of, it had been in a number of hands. The reason why it was fairly well preserved is because the Westminster School for Boys owned it. They used it for classrooms. And so they pretty much preserved it as it was. It was made into apartments. And fortunately, after it had been apartments, it wasn't damaged.
I was going to say, that's surprising.
Right. They actually were able
to
go underneath and find the original Louis Comfort Tiffany stencils. And so they could reproduce everything exactly as it looked like. Fortunately, too, when he lived in the house, it was photographed a lot. So we have photographs of it as it was furnished, as they lived in it. We know what sofa went where, even down to the type of pottery or that is on the mantle. And it was made by Rookwood, and we found out that Rookwood has a very similar piece, and so the curator acquired those pieces and put them exactly where he had them. So when you go there, you feel like you are in their home, not that you're in a museum.
And you recommend such a trip?
Oh, absolutely! It is so worth it. First of all, the guides just become more and more knowledgeable. Since I worked there, they put in a new visitor center that's very separate as a building. Before when I was there, the gift shop and all were in the basement, and the visitor center was there, and now it's in a completely separate building, so they can really prepare you before they take you over to the house.
So they continue to make it better and
better.
Oh,
absolutely.
And better.
Yeah. It's amazing. You can like it for so many reasons. Even if you don't like Twain, if you like Victorian architecture, Victorian collectibles, furniture, the time period interests you. It's beautiful. And having worked there, I had so many feelings. I used to close up at night, and I would hear the last tour going out through the bottom floor, two levels below, and I was turning off the simulated gas lights, which are amazing, and the house was getting dark, and I felt like I became sad because I felt like I was leaving my home. I didn't want to leave it.
Yeah,
and
is that comfortable?
It was always very difficult. Yes, it's very, very. Despite the fact that it's big and Victorian, there's. I always believe that there's something that the Clemens brought to the house, the family life that they brought. The spirit's still there.
It's still in there.
You can still feel it.
Feel the energy. Yeah.
And I'm not one with so much imagination, that I believe that there are ghosts are hanging around or whatever. But I still feel that the residue of what was the Clemens family is there.
Especially if they set it up in
Yeah,
that way, and they
yeah.
kind of like emphasize certain
And it's
things.
decorated. It's called custom decorated. You know, several designers. One was Louis Comfort Tiffany. He did the windows. He did the wallpaper. He did the stencils. And there's were other famous designers who came in and did various elements. The house was designed by Edward Tuckerman Potter.
Who is that?
He was a foremost avant-garde architect of the time.
Oh, really?
Who designed other buildings all up through New York for different universities and colleges, and he was considered way ahead of his time.
Wow.
And the house is considered quite ahead of its time.
Like a
very
Frank,
avant-garde.
like a Frank Lloyd Wright of the 1800s or something. Huh?
Yeah, exactly. It was in 1874.
Yeah, wow.
And the house is storybook Gothic, which is moving away from some of the Queen Anne style of the time. And a lot of people thought it was in poor taste because they hadn't caught up with it yet.
Oh, I see. When it really was ahead of its
Corn
time.
Opinions. That's what Corn Pone Opinions is about.
Yeah.
We think that something new is ridiculous, and then 3 years later, everybody is doing it.
It's such a funny piece that when
Yeah.
you showed it to me a couple weeks ago, I was really happy. It's short too. You can read it like 10 minutes, 15 minutes,
it's a short,
and
reading.
yet powerful, funny,
True, timeless,
and timeless,
timeless
incisive,
because it's still pertinent today.
And so is this book. Would you say The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn timeless, still
to a lot
still
of
relevant
degree.
today, or is this obsolete?
No, I say that it's timeless in that the characters are like Shakespeare characters. That even though they belong to another century, the human nature has not changed and never will. Every character in this book, whether they're major or minor characters, represents what humans are like.
Before we wrap this up, I do have one more question I have specifically for you to wrap this up. But before I do ask that, I'm curious if there was anything else you know about his life that sort of influenced this book. So another way to ask this is, why did he write this?
A part of it has to do with, once again, Huckleberry Finn. Tom Sawyer was a big success.
Oh, okay.
It was his signature book for the time. And so he was trying to create a type of sequel to that. However, because of the differences between the character of Huckleberry Finn compared to Tom Sawyer, a lot of it may have had to do with his own maturation in writing.
And Mark Twain's own
yes,
maturation.
exactly. And looking what his other contemporaries were writing about that was a little bit more serious subject matter. So I think it shows his own maturity.
That makes. And am I wrong? I thought I remember reading somewhere, or when I was in a class, that the professor was saying that this is one of the first works where you are inside a character's head as a narrator. That is like this first person, Huck Finn, and you get his dialect, and it's all through his perspective. That this is one of the first works to have actually done that. So there's like experimentation going on.
Yes, because Mark Twain is considered the father of realism.
Okay.
Despite the fact that what we consider American realism, which is Hemingway and Fitzgerald, we tend not to associate Mark Twain with that.
Yeah.
However, Huck Finn is not a fantasy book. It's about somebody living a real life. And in order to capture that realism, you have to get into the character's psyche.
And it's hard to read. I remember reading this for the first time. I was like, I don't think I can read this and enjoy it because You Don't Know About Me Without You Read right there. I'm like, what? The grammar is messing me up already.
Right,
and it's because
that's realism. That's how he would have
spoken it. And you know what? I heard somebody read this aloud, like an Audible or something. And if somebody knows how to read it, it is beautiful.
Oh, absolutely.
But if you don't know how to read it, it's clunky. It's like if you're not hitting the rhythms, the Southern dialect right, or whatever it is that his dialect is, it doesn't have the power. But if you can get somebody to read it to you that knows it and has that accent or something, you're like, whoa,
however,
that's a powerful book.
It is never, ever as bad as Wuthering Heights when those characters are speaking in that
I remember.
the northern accents of England from York County, where you have a narrator who not only remembers somebody saying something, but remembers it in that dialect.
Yeah, yeah.
And you're trying to read through that. And I remember seeing it was a book that somebody had written, just a small book, and it's called What Did He Say? And it was quotes from various books where dialect were being used, and what people may interpret it to say if they really
That sounds like
know
a
what
fun
they're saying.
project for like a classroom. Like
Yes.
here it is, interpret what you think this is being said. I remember with Wuthering Heights, I'm reading it and I'm like, you know what? I'm just going to skim this because even if I sat here for an hour, I don't know if I would be able to grasp truly what's going on because it was
Right.
also British
Right.
slang or British dialect.
Right.
which
Well,
is
and
even
that one in
further
particular,
removed.
it's not only British; it's like a different language.
Oh,
it's like
yeah.
Old English, you know. And their dialect, and it's. I mean, if you've ever been to that part of England, and people speak to you, you may not get what they're saying right away because the dialect is so different. Pronunciation is so different. It's more like what they speak in like the Scottish.
That's what I
Scottish
was thinking.
world.
It almost sounded like that. Yeah. So the last thing before we wrap this up is I would like to ask, although I don't want you to be banished, I don't want you to be shot, I don't want you to be prosecuted.
I'm gonna let that happen.
I hope not. But I do want to ask you, do you find a moral in this book at all? Or would you rather not answer that in
Well,
fear
no.
that you may be banished?
No, I find a moral in the sense that I believe that Huckleberry Finn really did learn something, and I just assume that maybe even Mark Twain realized that if he wrote a sequel, he could redeem the end of the novel and have a Huck Finn who ends up being in a situation where he's not tainted by Tom Sawyer's imagination and immaturity. And so, but I do believe, I mean, Huck struck upon a reality that he wouldn't have experienced otherwise.
And it makes sense that like your character starts here at the beginning of the book, and the way he ends is kind of at the same spot. Perfect to just kind of do that every couple of years and have another adventure and come back. Right, it sets it up like you're.
Or maybe every
like
time
you're
he comes back,
saying.
he's a little bit better.
But a little better. But and what I did like what you said though, that is that perhaps Huckleberry Finn did have some growth. Right? Is that what
To
you
help
said?
Mark Twain grow? Yes.
Or Huck in the book had a little bit of growth, but
Yeah.
Mark Twain
But
too.
Mark Twain did too.
Definitely.
Absolutely. It definitely reflects. It's Mark Twain's reality of coming to grips with things. And, you know, the fact that, you know, looking at Jim, you know, differently. That, you know, I mean, he's not that far removed from the Civil War. He's, you know, I mean, writing this during the time of Reconstruction in the South. Now, of course, he's living in New England and touring Europe at the time.
But still
but
a
he's
torn
from
country.
That, because he's from Missouri, he's from that, you know, that more Southern tradition. So he has to come to grips with, you know, how to perceive
Because the country's
a
changing.
modern world. Yeah, a modern world. And Huck comes to it, too.
I find that to be wonderful because I've come to the point where I just think that life is growth. This is like something that I've come to in my own life for my own personal self, that if I'm not attempting to grow every day, then I'm like regressing, or I feel like I'm not alive, and like I'm looking for things to do that'll help me grow or something. So if that is the moral,
Getting out of your comfort zone. You know,
exactly,
which is
and that's
what
where
Huck
growth
did.
happens.
Right. I mean, Huck could have stayed with the Widow Douglas. There could have been something that could have happened where he would have stayed there because he had Judge Thatcher, who was completely on his side, who was taking care of the money. By the way, he and Tom Sawyer, you know, they found a fortune.
They did.
Huck was worth a lot of money, and but it doesn't mean anything to Huck, because these, you know, other things besides money are important to him, like his freedom, and which is interesting. Wow. Same thing with Jim. You know, his freedom is more important to him than money.
Point.
And we could get into that whole thing. But at any rate, so you have Mark Twain had, you know, was basically the same.
And I think that
Finding out what's important to him.
yeah, what's important, and I think I love what you said there too. That is like growth happens kind of automatically as you're young. Everything's new. But as you get older, growth it's a little more difficult to have the sort of growth that you feel as when you're young, because everything's new, so everything you're developing, growing.
Everything's an adventure.
The book can kind of, in a way, remind us, let's say, that growth can happen at any time. You just got to get out of your comfort zone sometimes.
Yep.
Okay. And with that, we'd like to close the episode for the day. Thanks for joining us for Two Teachers and a Table. We hope to see you next week. Thank you.